For 11 years, my husband told every single person who hired me that I was a recovering addict with frequent relapses. Never in my life had I touched a single drug. At 37 years old, I found myself sleeping in a neighbor's utility room, brushing my teeth with cold water in her kitchen sink, sending resumes from her daughter's cell phone because mine was blocked, and receiving every third day the same message from my husband. Come back home, apologize in front of my parents, and this is over. Then on a Wednesday afternoon, my neighbor's phone rang. Someone asked for me using a name I hadn't gone by in 15 years. But what that caller brought with them was something my Aunt Connie had put together long before she died, without breathing a word to me, hoping to God I would never actually need it. My name is Claire Evans. I'm 38, and I grew up in a middle-class subdivision in Dayton, Ohio. One of those neighborhoods where the houses have black iron fences, potted geraniums on the porch, and absolutely everybody knows the name of every dog on the block. My dad was a soda distributor. He left before dawn and came back with his shoulders slumped and his hands stained from hauling filthy crates. My mom kept the books for a local hardware store 3 days a week, and the rest of the time, she organized everything in our house with a ruthless efficiency. I realize now it was her only way of feeling like she controlled anything at all. I was the middle child. I had an older brother, Ryan, and a younger sister, Danielle. We weren't a particularly happy family, nor were we particularly sad. We were just a family that followed the script. I met Mark at a wedding when I was 23. He was 4 years older, worked in logistics and imports, had perfectly parted hair, and always knew exactly which wine to order. My mother watched him walk up to our front door to pick me up for our second date. After he left, she told me he was a serious man. In my family, serious was the highest praise you could earn. I got married at 25. The reception was at a banquet hall just outside the city limits. 120 guests. A dessert table with 3 kinds of cake. Everything split right down the middle between the two families. A financial strain that nobody mentioned, but everybody felt in their bones. Those first few years were exactly what I thought a marriage was supposed to be. Mark made good money. We rented an apartment in a quiet part of town. I kept my job at a supply chain company where I'd been managing inventory for 4 years. We were a functional modern couple. Dinner out on Fridays, visiting the in-laws on Sundays. We even had a golden retriever named Clover. I couldn't tell you exactly when he started to change because it didn't happen all at once. It was like river water rising inch by silent inch while you walk along the bank, utterly unaware, until you realize you're wading knee-deep. First came the passing comments. He'd say my friends weren't a good influence, or that my boss stared at me a little too long at the holiday party. He wondered out loud if the dress I wore to my sister's birthday was too flashy for a married woman. I'd push back, we'd argue, and in the end, he would always say he was just speaking out of love. He just cared so deeply about how the world saw us. And I bought it. I bought it because I grew up in a house that taught me love and anxiety were pretty much the exact same thing. Then came the first time he brought up my job. It was a Saturday morning. I was reading in the living room when he sat down next to me. Using that calm, measured voice he reserved for important matters, he said he'd been thinking. He truly believed it would be better for both of us if I quit working. His salary was enough. We could finally start thinking about having kids without the suffocating stress of a 9-to-5. A woman who works too much, he said, ends up neglecting her home without even realizing it. I didn't quit my job that day, but the seed of doubt was planted, and doubt was all it took. I got pregnant at 28. I took my 12 weeks of maternity leave, but when I geared up to go back, Mark had already spent weeks polishing his argument. My place was with the baby. My mother chimed in, echoing him. Mark's mother said the exact same thing. I eventually resigned, handing over a notice I wrote in 15 minutes, but spent 2 agonizing weeks keeping in my purse. Those 2 years at home were the longest of my life. Not because I didn't love my son. I loved him with a primal intensity that terrified me, but because I was slowly fading out of my own identity. By the time Leo was 2.5, I was 30. I started quietly hunting for jobs on my phone while the baby took his afternoon naps. I sent out 3 resumes. 2 places called me back. The first interview was at an administrative services firm just 20 minutes from the house. I nailed it. The hiring manager told me I was exactly what they were looking for and promised a call the following week to finalize things. The phone never rang. I followed up myself a few days later. The woman on the other end spoke with a highly trained corporate politeness. She explained they had received information that raised red flags about my personal situation. Company policy strictly prohibited them from moving forward with candidates who had a history of substance dependency issues. I just stood there gripping the phone, completely lost. I begged her to explain. She told me someone close to me had reached out to HR to offer a confidential tip. I hung up, walked into the kitchen, and poured a glass of water. I drank it standing at the sink, staring out at the backyard, telling myself they had obviously mixed me up with someone else. A clerical error. These things happen. I managed to convince myself of that lie for another 3 months. I fired off more applications. The initial calls would come. And the interviews would progress beautifully. And then a brick wall of silence. Finally, one HR director had the brutal kindness to shoot straight with me. She said they'd fielded a call from someone claiming to be an immediate family member. This person warned them about my history of deep instability and a severe substance abuse problem I allegedly battled before getting married. They were terribly sorry, she said, but they simply couldn't take on the liability. I retreated to the bathroom in that office building and left the faucet running for 5 straight minutes just to drown out the sound of my own sobbing. That night, I waited until Leo was fast asleep. I confronted Mark point blank. I repeated exactly what they had told me, that someone was calling these companies, whispering about addiction and mental breakdowns. I had never touched a drug in my life, and I demanded to know if he had anything to do with it. He looked at me with a facial expression. He had spent years perfecting a masterful cocktail of deep concern and utter exhaustion. He swore he had no idea what I was talking about. He suggested I take a hard look at my life to see if anyone else held a grudge against me. Then he asked, why whenever things fell apart, I always made him the villain. We argued in circles for 2 hours. In the end, I broke down in tears. He just turned over and went to sleep. 4 more months dragged by. I started applying to companies in neighboring cities. I created a brand new email address. I even used my sister's phone number for the initial screenings. The pattern held firm. I'd make it to a certain stage, and then a mysterious call or email would torpedo my chances before I could even sit down for a second interview. Finding the notebook was a complete accident. Mark had gone out for a client dinner, and I was hunting for the iPad charger Leo needed for his bedtime stories. I checked the leather messenger bag Mark always left hanging on the back of his home office door. I didn't find the charger. I found a navy blue letter-sized moleskin notebook filled with graph paper. Inside, written in Mark's tight, meticulous handwriting, was a ledger. On the left side of the page, a list of company names, complete with phone numbers and HR emails. On the right side, dates each followed by a neat little check mark. Like a grocery list. Like crossing off a completed chore, I counted the check marks. 19. 19 companies over 4 years. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't cursed with bad luck. I was the target of a calculated siege. I gently closed the notebook and placed it back exactly how I found it. I walked out of the study, went straight into Leo's room, and sank to the floor next to his bed. I sat there in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing for a very long time. I don't know how many hours passed. I only know that by the time I finally stood up, I was absolutely certain I would never quietly shut that drawer again. The next morning, I waited for Mark to leave for work and for Leo to be safely dropped off at preschool. I went back into the house and photographed every single page of that blue notebook with my phone. Then I buried it back in his bag. That afternoon, I scoured the internet for a family law attorney and fired off an email outlining the bare bones of my living nightmare. The law firm replied 2 days later. But before I could take another breath, something happened that accelerated the timeline to terrifying speeds. Mark went through my phone while I was giving Leo a bath. I don't know if he spotted the email from the lawyer, the photos of his ledger, or if he just stumbled onto the sent resumes. What I do know is this. When I stepped out of the bathroom with my son wrapped in a towel, Mark was sitting on the edge of our bed holding my phone. He wore an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was something entirely hollow and ice cold. He looked dead at me and said, if I thought I was ever walking out of that house with his son, I was severely mistaken. He said he had the paperwork to prove I was mentally unfit. He had connections. I had no job, not a single dime to my name, absolutely nothing that didn't flow directly from his wallet. And in the eyes of the law, he whispered, that was all that mattered. Leo just stood in the bathroom doorway, clutching his towel, staring wide-eyed at both of us. I didn't sleep a wink that night. At 4 a.m, I texted my sister Danielle. I kept it brief. I told her I needed a place to crash for a few days, that I couldn't explain it over a text, and asked if her couch was open. She replied 20 minutes later, in the dead of the night. Her message was 4 words long. We're waiting for you. I slipped out the next day while Mark was locked in his office on a conference call. I packed Leo's little backpack. I grabbed his birth certificate, my social security card, 2 changes of clothes for each of us, and a single photograph tucked in my nightstand drawer. It was a picture of my Aunt Connie holding me in her backyard in Springfield when I was about 3 years old. She still had her baking apron on, laughing out loud at a joke the camera never caught. Mark texted me 2 hours later. If you come back tonight, we can talk. If you don't, I know exactly what I have to do. I didn't reply. We hid out at Danielle's house for 3 weeks. Leo slept on an air mattress in his cousin's room, and I took the pull-out couch in the den. Danielle didn't press me for details. She just poured my coffee every morning and let me dictate how much of the nightmare I wanted to share. Her husband, a quiet, thoroughly decent guy, would come home from work, high-five the kids, and never once asked when I was planning to move out. I went back on the job hunt from that couch. This time I used Danielle's email address and her best friend's cell phone number for the callbacks. I got further than I ever had. 2 separate applications pushed all the way to the 3rd round of interviews. Both of them evaporated in the exact same week. A logistics hub across the county sent a highly polished email stating they were moving in another direction. The other company didn't even bother to write. They simply ghosted me. Danielle drove me to meet with a family attorney. He was blunt, and the reality was grim. He laid it out plain, without my own income, and without bulletproof documentation of the sabotage. A custody battle was going to be an absolute bloodbath. He needed hard evidence. The photos of the blue notebook were a start, but they only proved a list existed, not that the phone calls were actually made. He needed a smoking gun, and I had no earthly idea how to find one. It didn't take Mark long to track me down. I don't know if he triangulated us through Leo, who occasionally FaceTimed him from Danielle's iPad, or if some mutual friend tipped him off. All I know is that one afternoon, a certified letter from his lawyer arrived in Danielle's mailbox. The letter stated Mark was initiating full custody proceedings based on maternal incompetence and my inability to provide a stable environment. Attached as Exhibit A was a clinical report from a private psychiatrist. The document claimed she had been treating me for the past year, detailing deeply disturbing behavioral patterns. I had never laid eyes on this doctor in my entire life. Danielle's lawyer reviewed the file and immediately flagged it as a fraudulent declaration. He said we could fight it, subpoena the doctor, tear it apart in court, but it would take a massive amount of time and a war chest of money. Money I simply didn't possess. Danielle offered to drain her savings to help me, but I knew she and her husband were in no position to bankroll a drawn-out legal war. That was when I truly stopped sleeping. Not just tossing and turning, but that paralyzed state, where your body is flat on a mattress, while your brain maps out 100 different escape routes, only to find every single one ends at a brick wall. Leo noticed. He started clinging to my leg during the day, begging me not to leave the room when he was playing with his blocks. Kids always know. Danielle told me I needed to cross county lines. Putting real distance between us would make it harder for Mark to serve me papers while we figured out a legal strategy. She had an old college roommate 2 hours away in a town called Shelbyville who rented out a spare room and was willing to take us in for a few months. I boarded a 7 a.m. Greyhound bus with Leo that very next Monday. In Shelbyville, we slept in a cramped bedroom with a single window overlooking an unpainted cinder block wall. The homeowner, an older woman named Ruth, was quiet, fiercely kind, and never poked her nose where it didn't belong. I managed to enroll Leo in the local public preschool. I kept firing off resumes. I applied to jobs in entirely different states using burner email accounts and a prepaid track phone I bought with cash at a local pharmacy. The pattern refused to die. 4 solid leads pushed all the way to the final interview stage, only to vanish into thin air just before the offer letter dropped. I stopped asking myself how Mark knew where I was applying. I finally understood. He was the one who set up our home Wi-Fi. He had access to my old app permissions, the recovery backups for the shared family cloud account I had carelessly used a few times. Somewhere along the line, he had installed a backdoor or maintained access to a digital footprint I hadn't scrubbed cleanly enough. It wasn't dark magic. It was simply the terrifying reality of a man who had spent years fortifying the perimeter for the exact moment I tried to escape. We had been hiding in Shelbyville for 4 months when Ruth knocked on my door one afternoon. She said there was a call for me on her landline. I stared at her, terrified, telling her I hadn't given that number to a single living soul. Ruth just frowned and said the woman on the line was asking for Claire Miller, my mother's maiden name, the name I used to go by as a little girl when I spent summers at Aunt Connie's house. The entire afternoon seemed to freeze in place. No one had called me by that name in 15 years. I picked up the receiver. The woman on the other end possessed a voice that was perfectly calm and surgical. She introduced herself as Patricia Vance. She was an estate attorney based back in Springfield, and she had spent the last several months hunting me down, acting on explicit instructions left in a letter by my Aunt Connie just before she passed away. I couldn't speak. I just held the plastic phone to my ear. She said she knew this was a massive shock to absorb all at once. But she insisted that if I could make the drive to her office, it was imperative we meet face to face. There were sensitive legal documents requiring my physical signature materials she was strictly forbidden from putting in the mail. My Aunt Connie had died 3 years prior at the age of 72. Her heart just quietly gave out on her degrading in utter silence, much like the way she handled every important thing in her life. She was my mother's older sister, a lifelong bachelorette, by fierce, unapologetic choice. back in an era when that sort of independence still scandalized polite society. She spent 40 years working as an executive secretary at a textile mill in Springfield. She never had children of her own. She loved me with a ferocious intensity that as a kid, I just accepted as normal. But as an adult, I recognized it for what it truly was, the sheer concentrated gravity of a woman who chose not to build a traditional family, pouring every ounce of that maternal fire into someone else. I traveled to Springfield that Thursday with Leo fast asleep against the window of the bus. Patricia Vance's law firm was tucked into a historic downtown street lined with brick sidewalks and heavy oak doors. Patricia herself was in her early 50s, hair pulled back tight, wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. She possessed the unshakable poise of a woman who has read way too many dark family secrets to ever be surprised by human nature again. She guided me to a leather chair, handed me a glass of water, and started laying out the truth. My Aunt Connie had left her a wax-sealed envelope and a thick dossier of documents attached with ruthlessly specific instructions. Patricia was ordered not to open or deliver the contents until after Connie's death. Furthermore, she was instructed to track me down only if I found myself in a state of absolute desperate ruin, not just a passing rough patch. Patricia explained that she had been quietly keeping tabs on my life from the shadows ever since my aunt passed. She had actually tried to reach me directly twice before, but my old numbers and emails were dead ends. It wasn't until she discreetly reached out to my sister Danielle and heard the raw terror of what was happening that she knew the trigger had finally been pulled. It was time. Aunt Connie's letter wasn't particularly long, 3 handwritten pages. The penmanship started out bold, but grew smaller and slanted toward the bottom, as if the physical weight of the ink was getting too heavy for her tired wrist. She wrote that she had known me since I was a screaming toddler, kicking the crib slats to fight off sleep. She said that in all those decades, she never once doubted I was capable of surviving on my own 2 feet. But she also knew that this world doesn't always pave a clean, fair road for capable women. She wrote about watching firsthand what the wrong marriage had done to her own mother, my grandmother, a woman who spent 30 years begging a man for permission just to buy her own blood pressure medicine. She wrote that when she first met Mark at that family wedding, something in his eyes felt dangerously familiar. He smelled exactly like the kind of men she had watched financially suffocate women her entire life. She admitted she had warned my mother about him, and my mother had immediately scolded her for being overly critical. So Connie decided to shut her mouth, smile for the cameras, and go to work in the dark. For 20 years, she had been siphoning money, not into the joint family trust, but into an untraceable solo account no one in our bloodline knew existed. She funded it with the surplus of her secretarial salary cash she never needed because she lived a beautifully Spartan, solitary life. Working through a wealth manager Patricia had recommended, Connie had bought equity in a regional commercial developer. Quiet, boring, conservative investments she never breathed a word about to a living soul. At the time, her heart stopped beating. That shadow portfolio was worth $280,000. I was the sole named beneficiary. The only catch was that Patricia was legally bound to lock it down in a trust until the day I truly needed to be found. But that wasn't the end of it. Patricia reached across her mahogany desk and slid a massive overstuffed manila folder right in front of me. I opened it. Inside were hundreds of pages of chronological logs. 2 years before she died, my Aunt Connie had put a high-end private intelligence firm out of Chicago on retainer. Their mandate wasn't to stalk me. Their job was to forensically document the invisible cage she already suspected was being built around me. The investigators had operated as ghosts for 3 years, harvesting data. They found 51 separate contacts made by Mark to companies where I had submitted applications. Every single one was logged. Date, timestamp, the exact name of the HR director he spoke to, and a bulleted summary of the poison he poured into their ears. In 34 of those instances, he posed as a deeply concerned family member. In 11, he masqueraded as a former coworker, calling to warn them about my erratic behavior before we tied the knot. And in 6 cases, he had actually mailed physical documents printed on the letterhead of a completely fictitious rehab clinic. The paperwork featured my full name plastered across the top of a fabricated medical intake form. The cyber guys at the PI firm had traced the routing data right back to the source. They had the raw metadata. They had IP logs matching the router in our living room and the MAC address of Mark's personal iPhone. They had crystal clear audio recordings of 3 separate phone calls where he used a fake name. They even secured sworn affidavits from 2 separate corporate recruiters who agreed to go on the record about the smear campaign. That damning psychiatric evaluation he used to threaten my custody was in the file too. The investigators proved the doctor was a real practicing psychiatrist, but her digital signature had been scraped, forged, and pasted onto a fraudulent document before being handed to Mark's lawyer. We weren't just looking at civil defamation anymore. We were looking at felony forgery. Patricia gave me the silence I needed to read. She didn't say a word as I flipped through page after page of my own engineered destruction. Out in the reception area, Leo was still dead to the world, wrapped tight in his little winter coat. The only sounds in the room were the muffled hum of downtown traffic and the relentless ticking of a brass clock mounted behind Patricia's desk. When I finally closed the folder, I looked up and asked how my aunt could have possibly known I would need an arsenal like this. Patricia took off her glasses, wiping the lenses with a slow mechanical precision. She told me Connie had said something to her that she carried to this day. Connie had looked at her and said, "I don't know if my girl is ever going to need this. I pray to God she doesn't. But if she does, I want her holding a loaded gun, not a blank cartridge." Tucked inside the front flap of the folder was a thick, embossed business card. It belonged to a high-powered litigator up in Chicago who specialized in high-conflict family law and financial abuse. Patricia explained that Connie had prearranged everything. If I ever showed up in her office looking like a hunted animal, Patricia was instructed to activate this specific lawyer. The attorney was already briefed on the broad strokes of my nightmare. She was waiting for my call. The attorney's name was Diane Sterling. She had the bedside manner of a scalpel, the kind of woman who takes furious notes while you talk and refuses to interrupt until you've bled out every last detail. She digested Connie's dossier in 48 hours. Then she sent me a hyper-specific written questionnaire telling me to sit down with a cup of coffee and answer every prompt with zero emotion. When we met for our follow-up, she said something that anchored itself deep in my bones. She looked right through me and said, "This isn't a messy divorce. This is forensically documented financial abuse. Systematic defamation resulting in quantifiable lost wages and the deployment of forged medical documents in a legal proceeding. We have 3 distinct felony-level offenses all wrapped up with a neat little bow. We are dropping the hammer on all of it at once." Diane filed the injunction on a Monday morning. Mark was served that Wednesday, right in the middle of his glass-walled office, directly in front of his executive assistant, by a process server who walked past security. Danielle told me about it later. She got the gossip from a mutual friend. She said all the blood drained from Mark's face. He just stood there, paralyzed, taking a long, humiliating minute to process reality before his shaking hand accepted the envelope. My burner phone rang 11 times that weekend. 8 missed calls from Mark, 2 from his mother, and 1 from an unlisted number. I didn't answer a single one. Diane had laid down the law from this second forward. Every syllable he wanted to communicate had to be routed through her firm. The legal grinding took 5 months. During that window, thanks to a brutal restraining order Diane secured in week 1, Mark was legally gagged from contacting any of my prospective employers. For the first time in years, I hit send on a job application without bracing for the inevitable sabotage. I landed an interview at a project management firm back in the city. I drove up, sat in the boardroom, and had a great conversation. I drove back to Shelbyville, convinced the curse would strike again. It didn't. They called me on Friday to offer me the job. I could start on Monday. I locked myself in Ruth's tiny bathroom and collapsed onto the cold linoleum floor. I sat there weeping for 10 solid minutes before I could trust my voice again. Ruth saw my face when I finally walked out. She didn't say a word. She just pressed a glass of ice water into my hand, radiating that quiet wisdom of a woman who has seen enough of the world's ugly edges to know when a soul has just been saved. The final hearing landed on one of those heavy, suffocatingly dry summer days. The courthouse smelled exactly like every courthouse in America: stale air conditioning floor wax and decades of nervous sweat. Mark walked in flanked by a defense attorney who looked visibly sweating and uncomfortable. His mother trailed behind them, taking a seat in the back row, her lips pressed into a thin white line. I walked in shoulder to shoulder with Diane carrying Aunt Connie's dossier. It had already cleared every evidentiary hurdle required to be entered into the official court record. Mark never looked at me. Not once during the entire proceeding. I looked at him exactly one time when the bailiff called the room to order, and then I realized he simply wasn't worth the caloric burn. I kept my eyes on the judge, on Diane, and on the mountain of paper that was about to bury him. His lawyer stood up and tried to spin a narrative. He claimed the dossier was the product of my paranoid obsession, a desperate attempt to blame a good man for my own rich history of emotional instability. Diane let him talk until he ran out of breath. Then she stood up and dropped the anvil. She played the audio recordings. She projected the IP routing data. She handed the judge the sworn affidavits from the corporate HR directors and capped it off with the forensic analysis proving his medical documents were forged. Mark's attorney flipped through the discovery packet Diane handed him. He stood there in dead silence for a very long time before trying to mount a rebuttal. When he finally spoke, his argument had the structural integrity of wet tissue paper. The judge's ruling came down 30 days later. Documented financial and economic abuse, defamation of character with quantifiable material damages, felony forgery executed within a judicial proceeding. The court ordered a punitive and compensatory payout of $140,000 calculated off my years of stolen wages and the deliberate sabotage of my professional reputation. I was granted primary physical custody of Leo. Mark was given strictly supervised visitation for the first 12 months, pending a psychological review. Diane called me at 5 p.m. to deliver the verdict. I listened to the breakdown. I thanked her, and I hung up the phone. I walked into the bedroom where Leo was racing his Hot Wheels across the rug. I sat cross-legged on the floor next to him. We spent a long time just lining up little metal cars, not saying anything profound. Because sometimes the most profound victories don't require a single word. Using the capital from Aunt Connie's trust, I signed a lease on a top-floor apartment back in the city. It had a tiny balcony where Leo could keep a potted tomato plant for his first-grade science project. Our very first afternoon there, before the moving truck even arrived, we ate deli sandwiches sitting on the bare hardwood floor of the empty living room. Leo looked up at me and asked if we were finally going to stay in this one. I told him yes. We were home. He studied my face for a second, nodded, and went back to his sandwich. I clocked in at my new job that following Monday. It was mid-level admin work at a decent-sized firm. Nothing glamorous, but it was mine. It belonged to me in a way nothing had belonged to me in a very long time. My first direct deposit hit 2 weeks later. I walked into a bank branch and opened a checking account solely in my name. The teller politely asked if I wanted to add a joint account holder. I looked her in the eye and said no. I signed the paperwork alone, took my debit card, and slid it into my wallet with a reverence she couldn't possibly understand and that I didn't bother to explain. The court-ordered settlement cleared 2 months after the gavel dropped. Mark had tried to mount an appeal, but his new lawyer took one look at Diane's bulletproof paper trail and realized there was absolutely nothing to argue. The wire transfer hit the exact account Diane set up. I didn't touch a dime of it for days, just logging into the app to stare at the balance, half terrified. It was a mirage that would vanish if I blinked. Mark's mother texted me a few weeks later. She wrote a rambling paragraph about how her son had been under so much pressure, how boys make mistakes, how Leo desperately needed his father. She typed out that family always finds a way to overcome everything. Notice what she didn't write. She didn't write, "My son systematically and sadistically destroyed 11 years of your life." She just said, "Family finds a way." I drafted my reply and routed it straight through Diane because the restraining order was still violently active. I stated that Leo would maintain a relationship with his father, strictly within the boundaries dictated by a judge of the state, because that was the law. I added that I had absolutely nothing left to say to her on the subject. Patricia Vance called me a few months into the new year, not acting as my fiduciary, but just checking in as a human being to see how we were breathing. She told me that Aunt Connie had lived out her final years with a profound, almost radiant peace that confused the people around her. She said that during one of Connie's final visits to the law firm, when her heart was practically failing, Connie admitted her only real regret was that she wouldn't be around to watch the fireworks. Patricia had held her hand and promised she would personally oversee the demolition. Connie just smiled, leaned back in her chair and said, "Then it's fine. I can go in peace." I am 38 years old today. I work for a company that values me strictly for the metric output I deliver, not for the phantom rumors whispered by a ghost. I am paying my own way through a master's program in business administration. On weekday mornings, Leo no longer grips my leg in terror when I drop him off at school. He just kisses. My cheek yells goodbye and sprints toward the playground. I have a balcony covered in cherry tomato plants that Leo waters with a deadly, enviable seriousness, even if he overwaters them half the time. I do not speak to Mark, not a single syllable beyond the bare minimum logistics required to hand off our son. I don't know how that plays out over the next 10 years. The judge left a door cracked open between us for the psychological benefit of a child. But just because a door is unlocked doesn't mean you are ever obligated to walk through it. I think about Aunt Connie constantly, mostly when I'm running financial audits at work or when I sign a binding contract with my own name, using my own pen, without asking a single man in this world for permission. She never tipped her hand. She never warned me, never primed me, never breathed a word about the shadow trust, the private investigators, or Patricia. She built the entire war machine in absolute silence, completely alone. She built it, not knowing if I would ever need to fire it, praying I wouldn't, but operating with the cold certainty that if the day came, I would have a loaded weapon in my hand. That is what real love looks like. It doesn't lock you inside a fortress to keep you safe. Real love quietly cuts a master key, slipping it into your pocket, for the day you finally realize the door you're standing in front of has been deadbolted from the outside. I'm not telling this story to harvest your pity or to make you hate a man you've never met. I'm telling it because I know with absolute certainty there is someone listening to this right now who has spent years convincing herself that wanting a career is a selfish whim, that craving independence is ungrateful, that asking for a life of your own is simply asking for too much. It isn't. Wanting a paycheck with your name printed on the top left corner is not betrayal. Demanding the right to sign a document that belongs exclusively to you is not selfishness. And sometimes, the person who loved you the most in this world wasn't the one who suffocated you with rules. It was the one who operated in the shadows, making damn sure you had options when the walls started closing in. My Aunt Connie believed that to her core, and she was absolutely right. Sometimes the person who loved you best wasn't the one who shouted it from the rooftops. It was the one who moved in total silence when nobody was watching. Aunt Connie made 0 promises and issued 0 warnings. She just spent 20 years quietly digging a tunnel out of the prison, using nothing but patience and a fierce, terrifying love for a girl who didn't even know she was locked up yet. If you have someone like that in your life, or if you possess the power to be that architect for someone else, do not let the opportunity pass you by. A quick note for you before you go. This story was constructed and narrated by artificial intelligence designed to entertain while sharing a message worth carrying with you. Drop a comment below and let us know what you thought. Hearing Claire's journey leaves a profound weight on my heart because it unmasks a terrifying reality that so many people silently endure behind closed doors. What masquerades as love and protection can sometimes be a meticulously crafted cage designed to strip away your identity and independence. The most striking realization I draw from this narrative is that true love does not seek to control, shrink, or paralyze you. Real love is exactly what Aunt Connie demonstrated, a silent, fiercely loyal commitment to your freedom and empowerment. We can apply this to our own lives by deeply evaluating the relationships we hold dear, asking ourselves if the people closest to us are building us up or slowly tearing down our wings. Financial independence is never just about money. It is the fundamental architecture of your personal sovereignty. We must teach our daughters, sisters, and friends that wanting a career, a separate bank account, and a voice of their own is not a betrayal of family, but a necessary shield in an unpredictable world. It is so easy to fall into the trap of believing that someone else's suffocating jealousy is just a symptom of their deep care for us. However, we must learn to recognize the subtle difference between a partner who holds our hand and one who ties it behind our back. This story inspires me to be an Aunt Connie for the people in my life, to be the kind of person who observes, closely supports quietly, and prepares a safety net for those who might not even know they need one yet. You do not need to shout your loyalty from the rooftops. Sometimes, the greatest act of humanity is just being the emergency exit for someone trapped in the dark. If you find yourself in a situation where your light is being dimmed, please know that starting over is not a failure, but a brave reclamation of your soul. We have a moral obligation to stop normalizing toxic behaviors that are disguised as traditional family values. Let this be a reminder that your potential belongs entirely to you, and no one has the right to rewrite your story without your permission. Ultimately, reclaiming your life is the most beautiful victory you can achieve, proving that even after the darkest storms, you can still plant your own garden and watch it bloom. Please remember that the story shared today is a crafted narrative designed strictly for educational and motivational purposes to help us reflect on our own lives.